Hilchos Shechitah Perek Arba Asar. The Laws of Slaughter, Chapter 14. Today, Be'ezrat Hashem, is the concluding chapter of the whole book 5. We're finishing yet another book of the Rambam with Hashem's help. And today, we're going to discuss a mitzvah that's related to Shechitah. It's related to slaughter, and it's called Kisui Hadam. Kisui Hadam means covering the blood. And essentially, the Rambam himself opens up by describing the mitzvah. Halacha Aleph, mitzvah saseh, lechasos dam shchitas chaya tahira oy oif tahir. There's a positive commandment to cover the blood after the slaughter of a kosher beast or a kosher bird. In halacha, we have birds, we have beasts, and we have domesticated animals. Domesticated animals don't require their blood to be covered. Beasts, like deer, or birds, like chickens, have to be covered. Like by kaparot, before Yom Kippur, when you slaughter your chicken, you'll see they have a whole little tray there where you can cover the blood with earth. Shenemar, the source for this mitzvah, is clear in the Torah. It says, Asher yotzud, seid chaya oy oif, asher ye'achel. If a person traps a beast or a bird, which is meant to be eaten, v'shafach es damai v'chisahu be'afar. So he needs to spill its blood, which we translated in chapter 1 to mean he needs to slaughter it properly, and then cover it with earth. And we'll soon see that even though Torah uses the word earth, there's other things you can cover it. Even though Torah says the word trapping, it's even when you don't trap it. But this is the common case. Lefichach, therefore, because it's a mitzvah, chayav levarich kaidem sheyechaseh. A person has to make a blessing before he covers the blood. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu al kisui hadam. Today, the text that we say is al kisui dam be'afar. We mentioned the earth element. Blessed is Hashem, who has sanctified us with his mitzvahs and commanded us about covering the blood. Now, the Rambam says, Kisui hadam noihig b'mizuman u'b'she'enoi mizuman. The truth is, the mitzvah of covering the blood applies whether the animal was at hand or it wasn't. Even though Torah describes it as only a case of when you trap an animal, truth is, even if it's in your backyard and you have chickens that are sitting over there and you're just slaughter one for dinner, you have to cover the blood. The only reason Torah says these words, that the precondition to the mitzvah is trapping, is because that's the common case. People didn't typically have a deer in their backyard. You went to trap it. So when you trap it, and you catch it, and you slaughter it, cover the blood. Interesting law. It only applies to unconsecrated animals, not to sacrifices. You make something holy to be a sacrifice, they wouldn't cover the blood. Whether it's sacrifices that were offered on the altar, or something that was just consecrated for the temple treasury. If you transgressed and you slaughtered them even outside the temple, which you weren't supposed to do, you don't have to cover their blood. The Rebbe has an interesting commentary on this. What's the reason for the mitzvah of covering the blood? There are many reasons, but maybe the spiritual one would be blood is life. Blood represents life, animation, energy. So when energy is in holiness, when blood is in sacrifices, there's no need to cover it. Spread the energy. Be joyful. Let it be felt everywhere. Energy in physical things, energy in unholy things, that should be tamed, that should be covered. And that's why there's also a difference between beasts and birds and domesticated animals. We're going to see in the end of the chapter also. Beasts and birds represent things that need to be fully tamed because they're wild, they're undomesticated. Domesticated means there are some things that you can kind of cross over the border. They're unholy, but they could be used for holiness. So that blood also doesn't have to be covered, because that represents a life or an energy in making the unholy holy, bringing heaven down to earth, and that's also good. That's the spiritual reasoning, perhaps, behind these halachot. Halacha Gimel. Shachat chaya v'oif ve'achar kach hikdishon. You slaughtered a beast or a bird, and after you finish the slaughter, you decided, you know what, I'm going to make the meat holy to Hashem. Or hikdash sadam. Or you made the blood holy to God. Chayav lechasos. You still have to cover the blood. Because in the moment when you became obligated, it was unholy. When you slaughtered it, it was unholy. Only afterwards you made it holy. So you still got to cover the blood. Halacha dalid kilayim haba mi behema v'chaya. A hybrid that's created from a domesticated and undomesticated animal. You take a deer and a goat, let's say, and you make a new hybrid. V'chein beria shehi sveik behema yichaya. And also a creature. There's a specific creature in the Talmud. It's called a koi. And it's called a doubt. The sages were in doubt whether it's a behema or a chaya. Tzarich lechasos. You have to cover the blood because maybe it's a chaya, maybe it's a beast. But you don't make a blessing because maybe it's a behema which doesn't require covering and the blessing would be in vain. If somebody slaughters an animal for a sick person on Shabbat, which is allowed, guy's in danger, you can slaughter an animal. You're liable to cover the blood after Shabbos. Don't cover it on Shabbos, because covering the blood on Shabbos involves melacha, involves labor, but you do have to cover it after Shabbos. Same thing if you slaughter on a holiday, when you're allowed to slaughter, but you slaughter a hybrid animal or a doubtful status animal, cover the blood, but cover it after the festival. Because since it might be a behema, which doesn't require covering, if you're going to take the earth to cover the blood, you might be doing a labor for no reason. And the Shulchan Aruch says, for this same reason, you shouldn't even slaughter such an animal on a festival, because it might lead you to problems. A person is slaughtering a bunch of birds or a bunch of beasts in one place at one time. You don't have to make a blessing and cover each blood individually. If you know you're going to be slaughtering a series of animals, like this is in a slaughterhouse, they know they're going to be slaughtering a whole bunch of birds. So he only has to cover the blood once. Make one blessing, one covering. Halacha vav, if blood got mixed in water. You slaughtered over a bucket of water, and the blood of the animal or the bird got mixed into the water. If it still looks like blood, you have to cover it. If it lost the appearance of blood, it's all got into the water, then you're exempt. If the blood of this chaya, of this beast, gets mixed into wine, or into blood of a behema, a domestic animal which doesn't require covering, and now you can't tell if it has the appearance because they're both red. So what do? You have to calculate proportionally. We imagine the wine or the other blood to be water, and we say, had this wine or had this behema blood been water, and the obligatory blood would have gotten mixed into it, if it would look like blood still, you have to cover everything. But if not, then you're exempt. That means there was too much other liquids, they overtook it, and so you're exempt from covering. You covered the blood, and then it got uncovered. No obligation to cover it again. You did it once, the mitzvah is done. If the wind covered it for you, you slaughtered under a tree. Came the wind, boom, and covered the blood. You're not liable to cover it anymore, because the wind did it for you. But if it became uncovered after the wind covered it, then you have to cover it. If you did it originally and then the wind comes, that's fine. But if you didn't even do it originally and now the wind uncovers it, you have to cover it. There's a debate in the Shulchan Aruch if this is an obligation or it's out of doubt. And therefore there's also a debate if you have to make a blessing in this case. If it's a doubt, you can't make a blessing. If it's an obligation, you have to make a blessing. Halacha ches dam hanitas. Blood that spurts all over the place. V'sha'al hasakin, and the blood on the knife. Im ein sham dam elahu chayav lechases. If there's no other blood, then you must cover that. Typically, when you slaughter an animal or a bird, some blood drips down that you can actually see on the ground, then you cover it. But maybe there was very little blood, or just blood spattered all over the place, and all you have was that blood, squirted against the wall or on the knife. If that's the only blood you have access to, you must cover that blood with earth to fulfill this mitzvah. Halacha tes, shachat v'nivla hadam bakarka, if you slaughtered an animal or a bird, and the blood got completely absorbed in the ground. Imri shumay nikar chayav lechases. If the mark is still recognizable, you have to cover that mark. V'im lav, if not, hareza kemishan kisasu aruach upatur milechases. It's exactly like the wind would have covered it, did the job for you, and so you're exempt. Halacha yud, ein chayav bekisui elodam shechitah haru'uya la'achila. You're only obligated to cover blood of a slaughtering which could have led to eating. So let's say verses 2 days ago, we learned about the law of not slaughtering an animal and a child in the same day, parent-child animals. Over there, the Rambam said, even if the slaughtering is a forbidden slaughter, it can't lead you to eating. You can't eat the product of your slaughter. It still counts as a slaughter. Over here, that's not the case. The only time you cover the blood is if the slaughter which you just did could be eaten. Shenemar, because the verse clearly says, it has to be a bird or an animal, asher ye'ochel, that you could eat. Lefichach, therefore, hasheiches v'nimtzeh treifa. If a person slaughters an animal, and it turns out the animal is treif, it had a mortal wound, or you slaughter an unholy animal in the temple courtyard, or you slaughter an animal or a bird that were supposed to be stoned. They killed a person, they're supposed to be put to death. Or you did a slaughter and it became a nevela. It was unacceptable shechitah, pater milechases. In all of these cases, you're exempt from covering the blood because this slaughter can never be eaten. It's an unkosher slaughter. Also, if a deaf mute or an unstable person or a child slaughtered privately, they're exempt from covering the blood of their slaughter because these are people whose slaughter isn't considered a slaughter. It's not a shechitah which you could eat, and therefore the blood doesn't have to be covered. So that was as far as when to cover and which type of slaughter to cover. Now, let's talk about bamem mechasin. What materials do we use to cover? What can you cover the blood with? So the Rambam lists a couple of materials. Bisid, number one, lime. This is lime in the top left corner. Ubegipsis, gypsum. It's a kind of rock that can be ground into like a sandy material. You can use it to cover. Bezevel dak, thin fertilizer. Ubechoil dak, she'ena yotzer tzadich lekatshay. Thin sand. The grains are very thin. A potter wouldn't have to crush it. Ubishchikas avonim v'charasim. Crushed rocks, crushed pottery. Ubina'aydas shel pishtan daka. Fine flax chips. We call this mulch. When you beat off all the wood from the flax, it's called mulch. Ubinasaydas charashim daka, thin sawdust. Ubilevena v'charsis umegufa shekatsha. And with bricks, burnt mud, or clay that was crushed. Shekal elu min afarhein. All of these materials are considered to be earth. And in the Torah it says, v'chisahu be'afar, you cover it with earth. Now the Rambam in this list didn't even list earth, because it's so obvious that it's okay. Other texts actually have the word be'afar with earth as well in this halacha. Aval im kafal of kli, like kisahu ba'avanim, but if you simply put a bowl over it, let's say, or you covered it with a big rock, ein ze kisoi, it's not a covering. Shanemar be'afar, it has to be with earth or something like earth. Yud beis lefichach, therefore, because you cannot use thick coverings, ein mechasin bezevel gas v'chel gas, you cannot use thick fertilizer or thick sand to cover the blood. The kemach v'subin umursan, as well as flour, bran, grain fiber, ushchikas klematches, and crushed metal. Lefish ein elu min afar. These, even if they're crushed and they're small material, they're not a type of earth. They're other material. Chutz mishchikas hazahav bilvad, except for filed down gold. If you filed down gold and made it into like a dust powder, you can use that to cover blood. Shanemar, because we have two verses in the Torah that refer to dust, to gold as dust. Shanemar ve'afroi zahav loy. It says the dusts of gold belong to him. Ve'omer, and it also says about this week's parsha, the golden calf, ad asher dak le'afar, that Moshe Rabbeinu ground it until it was thin like dust. Now, what was the calf made out of? Gold. Egel hazahav. So the gold, when it was ground, was called dust. So therefore, from here we see, from a negative part of the Torah, actually, we learn how to fulfill a mitzvah. That you can, who would use the gold powder? But if you did, it's okay. Halacha Yud Gimel as well. Mechasin b'shichur v'hu piach hakivshan. We're allowed to cover with soot from an oven. This dark black substance which collects in an oven. Ubekoichal, and with what's called stibium. Stibium is a bluish powder that's used as a base for makeup, at least in ancient times. Uvenikras psilim, and with powder from mills. You see, this is a hand mill. So besides for the actual flour that gets ground, there's all this powder material that remains. You can use that. Ube'efer, and with ashes. Regular ashes you can also use. Bein efer eitzim, bein efer begadim, whether it's ashes from wood or ashes from clothing. Afilu efer basar shenisraf, even ash of meat that was burnt is also qualified. Shari Kosov, because it says, by the Para Aduma, it says, Me'afar sreifas hachatas. They take from the dirt, the dust that was created from the burnt offering. That shows you that when you burn meat, you burn a cow, the ashes that are left are called dust. Umuter lechasais ba'afar iranidachas. It's even permitted to cover the blood with dirt from a city which was condemned. In the first book, we had when the whole city does avodah zarah, you have to burn the whole city down. But the ash from that burning could be used to cover the blood, because it's called earth. Halacha Yudalid Hashaychet. When a person slaughters, tzarich litein afar lemata, he needs to have first some earth on the ground. The achar kach yishchet boy, then slaughter onto the earth. The achar kach yichasa ba'afar, and then you cover it with dust. Avallah yishchet bekli v'yichasa ba'afar. You cannot slaughter, let's say, into an open container, and then just put dust on top of it, Has to be dust on bottom, slaughter, dust on top. This is why when you go to kaparot, slaughter a chicken, you'll always see on the ground they have a layer of this earth, and the guy slaughters onto the earth, and you take from the tray and you cover it. Halacha tezvav, talking about kaparot, umisha shachat hu yichasa. There's a special mitzvah that the person who slaughtered, he should be the one to cover it. Shenemar v'chisahu be'afar. He should cover it with earth. The Taz in Shulchan Aruch even writes that if you go ahead and cover someone else's slaughtering blood, the court could fine you for stealing the mitzvah. And that's why today, since everybody, when you give your chicken to the shochet, you want to have the mitzvah of covering the blood, you have to actually ask permission. You're supposed to ask the shochet to give you the privilege of covering the blood. Because if he does that, then it's okay. But otherwise, by default, he's the slaughterer. If he's the slaughterer, he has to cover it. It's only if he didn't cover it and someone else sees the blood, chayav lechases. Then you have to go and step in and cover it. Shazu mitzvah b'fnei atzma ve'eina tluya b'shechit levad. Because it's a mitzvah on its own. At the end of the day, it's not dependent on the slaughterer. The Torah learns us from these words. Look, it says, "V'ish mi b'nei Yisrael." It's talking to all Jews. All Jews have to, or maybe in the verse before, it says, "Daber el b'nei Yisrael." The point is, the verse is spoken to the Jewish people at large. So while, particularly speaking, ideally, if you're the one who slaughtered, you should cover it. But if he missed it and someone else sees it, then they should cover it. And now we have the final halacha of the chapter, the final halacha of the set of laws, and the final halacha of the entire fifth book of the Rambam. The Rambam says, "Ukeshem mechasa," when you cover the blood, lo yechasa beragla. It's important that you don't cover the blood with your feet. Ella biyadoy oy besaken oy bekli. Use anything else. Use your hand. Use a knife. Use even a utensil. This is a picture of the Rebbe himself doing kisui hadam after kaparot. He would come out early in the morning on the day before Yom Kippur, and the slaughterer would slaughter the chicken. And the Rebbe had a custom that he would pull out feathers from the chicken that was just slaughtered, and he would use those feathers to cover the blood. With the feathers, he would slide the earth across. You see, this is the slaughterer, because it's the Rebbe, he don't want him to bend down more than he had to, so he prepared a little piece of paper on the floor, slaughtered the chicken over it, picked up the paper with the earth, and the Rebbe can slide the feathers with it. The point is, use anything which is not your foot. In the Talmud it says you're supposed to use your hand. And then it says don't use your foot. But the Rambam is more focused on the saying than not. Just don't use your foot. Whatever else it takes. Use a hand, use a knife, use a utensil. Why? We don't want you to behave in the future in a disgraceful or a scornful way, which might lead you to treat more mitzvahs disgracefully. And talking about this, the Rambam concludes the book, as he always does every book, with an ethical message. But the Rebbe once explained this actually twice, and it's just beautiful how this ties into this book specifically. The Rambam ends off, "She'ein hakaved la'atzman shel mitzvos, ela lemisha tziva behen baruch hu." The honor that we have for mitzvahs is not for the mitzvahs themselves. It's for the God, the Hashem, the commander who's behind the mitzvahs. The simple meaning is because the Midrash says the mitzvahs are Hashem's agent. Kabdu et ha-mitzvot shehin shluchai. When you honor an agent, you don't honor the agent himself, you honor the person who sent him. So the mitzvahs also are God's agents, and so we don't honor the agents, we honor God. On a deeper level though, Hashem is present in his mitzvahs. When you put on tefillin, it's not the cow leather that you're putting on, it's the godliness in the mitzvah that you're putting on. So even in the mitzvah itself, the honor that we have for them is not for the mitzvah act itself, but for the godliness present within it. And it was Hashem, the commander of the mitzvahs, who gave us these mitzvahs with a threefold purpose. He saved us from groping in the dark. And he set up for us a lamp to straighten the crooked things, or some texts have liyasher hama'asim without the kuf, to straighten our actions. And they're a light to light up the paths of straightness. Now, it sounds like just poetic, but if you look closely at it, there's three types of mitzvahs. One that saves us from the darkness. That's when we stay away from transgressions, negative commandments. There's a second type of mitzvah, which is straightening out crooked things. That means you take something which is by default unholy, material, but you make it holy. Classic example, the laws we're learning right now, Shechitah. There's no obligation to slaughter an animal, but if you want to eat an animal, you want to use it, there's a mitzvah for that. There's a mitzvah for how to straighten the crooked things. And then you have paths of straightness. That means paths that are already straight. They're holy in essence. And the mitzvahs are also there to add more light. They add more light to the already holy things, which, by the way, fits very well with the three categories in covering the blood of this chapter. There's covering the blood of an unholy beast or bird. That's like saving you from groping in the dark. Things that are wild, unholy, cover it, tame it. Then you have an animal, a behema, a domesticated animal, which is liasher hama'akashim, something which could be used for unholy, but it's more of a tame animal, so you don't have to cover the blood. And then you have holy sacrifices, where that's the source of life. The source of energy comes from holiness. That's nesivos hayosher. We don't have to cover the blood at all. The Rebbe also, in a different time, connected it to the three sets of laws in this book. There's three halachot. Forbidden marriages, that's the dark. Stay away from the forbidden marriages. Forbidden foods means using food in a kosher way, so it could be crooked, but you straighten it. And then shechitah, which refers to a high spiritual level of v'shachat means mashach, lifting something to the holy level. That's lahiris nesivos hayosher. So these three expressions are matched exactly to the general purpose of mitzvahs and the three specific mitzvahs we're learning about in this book.
Beautiful.
It's fantastic. It's zucker zis. It's sweet like sugar. I'm not even doing it justice, but you have to learn the talker in the original text. It's gorgeous. V'cheinu omer, as it says in the verse in Tehillim, ner leragli dvarecha v'or li nesivasi. Your words, your mitzvahs, are a lamp for my feet, and they're light for my path. In other words, it's gradual. A lamp is very small. Light is like the light of day. It's light. You don't need a source of light for that. The whole day is light. Mitzvahs begin by having a small influence. They act as a candle. They light up just my little area, and then they become a light for my entire path. That's the purpose of mitzvahs. Mitzvahs are much, much greater than just the physical act. They're Hashem present there to keep us away from the dark and to bring us to the light. Brich Rachamana Desayan, blessed is the merciful and granted us assistance. Nikmar Sefer Chamishi, V'hu Sefer Kedusha. This concludes the fifth book, the book of holiness. Uminyan Prakav Shleisha V'Chamishim. 53 chapters we spent on this. Hilchos Yisurei Bia, Shnayim V'Esrim Prakim. 22 chapters for forbidden relationships. Hilchos Ma'achales Asures Shiva Asar Prakim. 17 chapters for forbidden foods. Hilchos Shechitah Arba Asar Prakim. 14 chapters laws of slaughter. Mazel Tov for concluding yet another book of the Rambam.